Our next speaker is Rio Peterson. She is the Affinity Partnership Manager for Clio, cloud-based legal technology. Rio has been a frequent and well-received speaker at our plenaries, usually having to fly red-eye flights from the West Coast to join us, so hopefully she did not have to travel anywhere to be with us today.
Just to my living room.
All right. Rio is a recent recipient of her company's internal Clio Impact Award, recognizing, among other things, her healthy disregard for the impossible and her ability to reject the status quo. When we're offline, I would love to chat with you, Rio, about the full name of that award and its history, but we'll leave that for now. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rio from Clio.
Oh my gosh, John, thank you so much. That was like the best intro. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And hi, everybody. As always, I am so happy to get to talk to all of you. And as John mentioned, I have spoken to you before. And yeah, this time I didn't have to take a red-eye flight. I just had to navigate to my living room. So that was, a trip that I've made before. So I had it under control. So I'm so happy to be talking to you all today. And I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. And Okay, can everybody see my slide deck? Is that looking good to everyone? Katie, can I get a thumbs up? Perfect, wonderful, thank you. Okay, so again, hi everybody, and welcome to today's session. I just need to get some of these little windows out of my way here. Living in this new technology world, we have to arrange our windows. Right, so today I'm going to be talking to you about accelerating change and all the ways that COVID-19 has impacted the legal profession. So we're definitely living in some interesting times. So before I get started, I do want to mention that the slide deck and all of the materials for this session can be found on the Fola Plenary website. Katie was kind enough to upload all of that information today. So if you are interested in any of the resources for this session or in any of the slides, that's where you can find them. And the other thing is I will be sticking around to answer some questions. So if you have questions for me, feel free to throw them in the chat. And once I'm done the session, I'll be happy to get to them and to answer them for you. Oh, there we go. Okay, so as John mentioned, my name is Rio Peterson, and I also am known as Rio from Clio, and I'm the Affinity Program Manager at Clio. And what that means is that I work with all of our Bar Association and Law Society partners from across North America. So we work with our partners to deliver really key resources to their members, as well as we go to their events and do a lot of thought leadership and public speaking. And I really just try to make sure that Clio and our partners get the most out of partnering together and that we're able to provide the most value to our partners, to you, to bar associations, and to your members. And I really love my job. Part of my favorite thing is not just public speaking, but also the fact that I get to talk to lawyers about kind of tools and data insights and tips to help build thriving practices. And that's particularly important in times like the ones we're living in right now, when we're living with a lot of uncertainty. It really helps to be able to have some tools in our toolbox to help us thrive. So it's always my pleasure to share that information with everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a body of research that Clio has done called the Legal Trends Report, and some of the insights that that information has revealed. Particularly, I've got to make sure to shut my phone off because, that's important, but particularly as that information relates to the impact that COVID-19 has had on the legal profession. So this session is actually going to be in two parts. The first part is going to focus on specific insights and data points in the Legal Trends Report. And part two will focus on how we can take those insights and make them actionable, because information without action is just half of the equation. So it's really important to me that some of you, or all of you, I hope, walk away with something actionable that you can not only apply to your own practices if you are practicing, but also take back to your members. So this past October, we released our 2020 Clio Legal Trends Report. And for those of you who've been following our work for a while, you'll know that this is actually our 5th annual edition. And that's really, really exciting because this is the first kind of longitudinal study of the legal industry. And each year, our goal has been to provide an analysis that builds off of previous year's insights and strives to dig deeper and deeper into the different issues that we are curious about. However, 2020 has certainly presented us with some unique challenges, and our usual MO, has been to treat kind of every opportunity as a chance to kind of take a broader look at the legal profession in front of us. And one of the things that's very interesting about the profession itself is that it's quite fragmented. About 50% of practitioners are solos, and about 80% of people are in firms of 1 to 10 people. So again, because of COVID, all of these firms are impacted in very different ways. And this year has provided us with a tremendous opportunity to actually dig into kind of the factors that are affecting law firms in this time and to seek to get kind of a bigger picture of the COVID landscape and how it has impacted the legal profession. And I think we could all agree that opportunities like this are quite rare. So we have made it our focus and our goal to take advantage of this opportunity and find a bit of a silver lining in these challenging times. And I think that this quote from Rory Driscoll at Scale Venture Partners kind of perfectly describes the interrupt that's happened in the past year. Rory states that this is the most unique economic event in history. It's a simultaneous, worldwide, voluntarily induced recession. And I don't think that I or maybe anyone at Clio could even come up with words more apt to describe what we've begun to observe as we sought to kind of do our legal trends research study this year. And that, of course, brings us to a foundational concept that I want to share with you. And I want you to kind of keep in mind as we go through this presentation. And that is the concept of VUCA. So VUCA is a leadership theory that was developed by Warren Bennis and Bert Nanas in the 1990s in response to the collapse of the USSR. And so at its core, VUCA seeks to help people develop the skills they need to not just lead, but to also thrive during times of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And with this year's Legal Trends Report analysis, we've actually worked really, really hard to try to identify data and information that is going to help all of us move beyond VUCA and get to what's called VUCA Prime. So that embracing this VUCA Prime mindset, which is our mission to kind of give you the tools and the insights that you need to transform volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity into vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. And so with this in mind, this is the framework that I really want you to keep in mind and to understand that this is kind of where our thinking was when we came up with the intention to provide you with these tools and insights. And so just keep this in the back of your mind as we move forward and talk about this year's findings. Now, in preparing the insights themselves, we do consult a few different important sources of data. So the core of our annual analysis is always anonymized and aggregated usage information from the Clio Cloud platform. So we are able to provide insights from the operations of tens of thousands of law firms and with over 100,000 practicing legal professionals. Now we anonymize and aggregate all of this data and we report it as trends. So we're not reporting on any distinguishing information. This is just kind of a broader understanding of the landscape. Now, accompanying that usage data are two surveys. The first one is of US legal professionals, and the second one is of US legal consumers who have retained a lawyer or could have retained a lawyer in the past 2 years. Now, in both cases, we're able to do what's called a longitudinal study, which means that we ask the same questions over a period of time to understand how patterns changed as we get deeper and deeper into post-pandemic 2020. Now, for those of you who have seen me speak before and who have been present when I spoke to Fola in the past, you'll know that it is absolutely my dearest wish that I would be able to provide this level of data and insight for a specifically Canadian market. However, we're just not there yet in terms of technology adoption to be able to provide these kind of insights. I do feel, though, that COVID-19 is really propelling us forward in terms of embracing technology and adopting tech, specifically in the legal profession. And I really, really hope that next year I will have more Canadian insights to share with you. I'm pushing really hard for us, for Clio, to do the kind of same type of consumer survey and legal professional surveys that we've done in the US. So that being said, I have found some Canadian specific information that I've added where possible to kind of reinforce that the trends that we observed in the US are somewhat mirrored in Canada. And this has been kind of a similar journey for the legal professions in both the US and Canada. Now, one other foundational change, which is incredibly important, is that this year we chose not to just wait to publish our annual raft of insights in an overall document, as we usually do, but we actually got to work in early on to understand the impact that COVID was having. And we began to publish those insights on an almost real-time basis in order to assist the legal profession to develop and embrace that kind of VUCA prime mindset in real time. And that was a really, really big win, particularly for some of our bar partners in the US, as they were able to provide their members with a little bit of insight into what was happening on a broader scale and help them to kind of navigate this situation and to not feel so alone in facing the obstacles that a lot of them are facing. So here's what I have in store for you today in terms of the contents. Now, for part one, we're going to explore this in three parts. So first, we'll look at unpacking some of those insights on the very pronounced impacts of COVID-19 on the legal profession. Second, we'll look at the aggregation of marginal gains for technology. And this is a very interesting and I would say kind of outstanding observation that we had in conducting our analysis that we'll dive deep into and spend a bit of time on. And third, we'll look at this kind of rapid evolution and touch on the rise of cloud-based, client-centered legal practice and how that approach seems to be outperforming its peers in this moment of pronounced kind of evolution and equilibrium shifting. And after that, we will shift into part two of our talk and talk about how we can take all of these insights and make them truly actionable. So let's begin. So the first place we'll start is talking about the impact of COVID-19 as we saw it described in the analysis that we performed. So for each section, I'd like to open up with a quote from a legal professional. So in addition to the overall analysis, we also collected insights from how things are going on the ground. And this one really stood out among others. So from Jason, who is a practicing lawyer, we have, "I'm just trying not to lose too much money. COVID is going to cost us between 100,000 and 500,000 in revenue because a lot fewer cases are coming in." And, I think as soon as the realities of the pandemic really set in and the impacts were felt, we started to get many, many identical reports on just what an economic toll this was really taking on the legal profession. And we got to work in kind of trying to decipher some of this analysis and to understand it more deeply. So on this chart here, I've got a week by week breakdown going from the first week in January through to about halfway through the year in June. Now, these blue bars describe how many new reported coronavirus cases that were in the United States. And you can see that the number starts to spike pretty aggressively starting at about March 23rd. Now, the red line we have plots the percentage change versus a starting point baseline of how many new matters firms across Clio reported having intake of. And you can see that as soon as cases of COVID began to spike, we saw a very, very steep decline in the number of new matters created by Clio using law firms across the board. And this is, of course, a great proxy for how much demand was in the marketplace and what was going on with client inquiries and how much new business was coming in through the door. So then also, and kind of equally pronounced insight we saw was that the year-over-year percentage change in monthly billing volume. So how am I doing this month versus last year in the same month? which is represented by the blue line. This began to steeply decline as well, although it was somewhat delayed. So we saw that people were able to work a little while longer through collecting on their work in progress and their receivables before eventually starting to feel that strain of not having as much cash coming in the door and not having as much revenue coming in due to declining matter volumes. Now, extending this analysis, we also sized up and filtered this information in a lot of different ways. And just one of those ways is that we broke it down further into practice areas. So if we look at some examples, firms that are more on the transactional side of things like criminal, personal injury, and especially traffic offenses, we saw declines in as much as 70% versus previous years pre-pandemic levels, declines in matter intake volumes. And that is by far, in our 5 years of publishing this study, the most sustained and profound economic impact that we've ever seen in legal. And I mean, I guess to sum it up, the results were real and they were felt across the board. And they culminated in, of course, and all of these insights culminated in an insight that says that 61% of consumers surveyed said that they would not be able to afford a legal problem and an unexpected legal issue. And we can actually see a similar trend happen in Canada as well. During April and May of 2020, Canada's unemployment rate soared to 13.7%, which is the highest that it's actually been since 1982. And during the initial days of the pandemic, 3 million jobs were lost over March and April, and about 2.5 million more had their hours slashed. So it's pretty easy to draw the comparison here and see that it's unlikely that a large number of Canadians would be able to afford an unexpected legal issue during this time. Now, perhaps the most alarming finding of our legal trends report research is that 33% of consumers actually believed that law firms had stopped offering services, perhaps incorrectly extrapolating that information from news of court closures and et cetera, when in reality, only 2% claim that they had to close their doors and cease operations during this time. So it's really interesting to note this kind of disconnect between consumer perceptions and actually the reality of what was happening with law firms during this kind of uncertain time. And so what we've done in the Legal Trends Report is to build off of this analysis of the impact of COVID and to extend a bit of that, that kind of analysis forward. And what we've seen is certainly that the impacts were most profound for both new matters and revenue volumes in April and May. And I think we all remember that was a very uncertain time. It was kind of a lot of panic and a lot of, oh my gosh, what is this crazy situation we're all going into? So that makes a lot of sense. But fortunately, we did end up seeing a rebound in July and August, and that has, stayed kind of under our baseline for a sustained period. So things have bounced back a bit, but we've seen it mostly what is described a U-shaped recovery in economic terms. So, but it's not quite there yet, and we're still below previous pre-pandemic levels. So at this point, I suspect that this really isn't the most uplifting news, and I certainly don't want to just sit here and relate bad news to you, right? That's not why I came here. Well, it's not why I'm in my house talking to you. So my job, again, it's not to leave you in VUCA. It's not to leave you in that uncertain state. It's to get you to VUCA Prime. And the key step to that is to uncover a bit of insights around what's taking place kind of in the background. And so that brought us to kind of the second step of our journey, which was understanding and observing the aggregation of marginal gains and how that is impacting firms that were perhaps faring a bit better during this pandemic than other firms. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this particular concept, this was popularized in a book called Atomic Habits, and it talks about the work of David Brailsford. Now, he took over as the director of the British national cycling team in the mid-2000s. Now, early mid-2000s. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, the British cycling team was like literally the laughing stock of the athletic world. They were so bad that some bike manufacturers actually refused to sell them their bikes because they didn't want their brand associated with the performance of that team. And like, it really doesn't get much worse than that in the pro sports world. However, when David took over, he was able to implement this theory around the aggregation of marginal gains. And this finding and this theory suggests that making multiple 1% improvements adds up in a very, very meaningful way. And so in several short years, and just in time for the London Olympics, this team actually began to become one of the best and most record-breaking and dominant teams in cycling history. They won a slew of Olympic gold medals. They also have won several Tour de France titles. And this dramatic transformation wasn't the result of one big change. It was actually brought about by all of these tiny changes that David implemented. Things like having heated bike shorts to prevent friction when you're on your bike seat, having slightly lighter pieces of, removing as much, extra kind of weight from the bikes as they possibly could. So all of these little things that he implemented and that they tried really added up to deliver this huge, impactful result and to really push this team forward in a way that they had never experienced before. And that really brings us to understanding how some of this, aggregation of marginal gains is happening in the legal profession. So despite the shock economically and this huge humanitarian toll that we've seen through the COVID pandemic. So to start another anecdote from the ground, this one from David, a practicing lawyer, who said that everything I'm doing in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, how can I make my life easier? And how can I make it look more professional? And that might not sound like groundbreaking change, but in the face of adversity, having this kind of challenge to just get incrementally better and to look a little more professional can actually be the difference between whether you sink or swim. So that's exactly the mindset that we're talking about. And we started to see this appear in ways that were trackable in the legal trends report. And that got us to kind of using this VUCA prime term to describe this, which is we looked at firms that proved to be the most agile or the most adaptable. Now, we saw firms deploying client-facing technologies in 3 very important areas. And these firms began to seriously outperform their peers despite the overall trend we saw of this huge economic decline. So the first was using online payments. Now, we're going to look at some of these charts for each category. So I'll spend a quick minute here making sure that everyone's acquainted with this information. But basically, what we have here is the blue line, which identifies firms that use electronic payments, and a red line identifying firms that did not use electronic payments. Now, we saw them start off in terms of new matter volumes in this period that we observed around the same level. So they kind of started off in the same place. And they certainly experienced the same motion. You can see they both dropped around the same time, again, April and May. But what we ended up seeing was that firms that used electronic payments actually tended to pull away and rebound a little bit quicker than firms that were not using electronic payments. And as we saw as well on the revenue side, where the gap actually widened a bit and showed that not only were these firms doing more work, they were actually getting proportionately more revenue as we got further and further into the pandemic. Now, if we look at this data in relative terms, the kind of percentage difference that we're seeing between firms using electronic payments and those not using electronic payments, which is the dark blue line on the bottom, and we can see that the revenue per lawyer, which is the blue line on the top, we started to see this difference widen. So to put it in simple terms, firms using electronic payments in August of 2020 collected 16% more revenue per lawyer than firms that didn't. And that brings us to the second technology that we studied, which was client portals. So these are tools that enable you to engage online in exchanging messages, documents, and other resources with your clients. Now, things that we could largely do in person prior to the pandemic. And the same data points here, and we can see, again, very similar trends, if not even a wider gap developing. So on both the matter side and on the revenue volume side, we saw firms using client portals start to bounce back faster. Certainly, again, going through the same overall impacts, but just getting that much better. And we can see that incremental difference in some of these marginal gains that we described in the British cycling team example, right? It's not a huge change, and it's not a massive difference, but it is making an impact. And again, they started to build up. So in August of 2020, we've seen these firms that are using client portals report 20% more revenue per lawyer than firms that are not. And finally, lastly, we looked at another really important step, and we looked at firms that were using client intake or legal CRM software solutions. So CRM stands for Customer Relationship Management. This is a technology designed to help you identify, track, and convert inquiries and leads that coming into your business into new matters, and to really drive that kind of top of your marketing funnel. So to bring in new business. So we decided to look at how firms that were deploying those technologies perform versus those who didn't. And again, here we started to see that the most pronounced of these three individual gaps that we saw in terms of matter volume against the same overall motion. But this widening gap between the blue line and the red line here is a bit of a faster rebound than previous levels. So once again, we saw that, as well as our year-over-year comparison of revenue between where these firms' performance landed, that firms using this technology, using client intake, were actually rebounding much faster than firms that weren't. Now, if we look at this in relative terms, this one is even more of a difference than where these firms started off converting more matters and have been sustainably converting more matters. And it's been increasing, despite the fact that they're going through the same ups and downs and the same challenges that firms that are not using this are going through. And again, we see this revenue performance that is closer to even 25% more revenue per lawyer than firms that are not using this technology. And the thing about aggregation of marginal gains that happens is that all of these little incremental changes, they stack on top of each other and they translate into one huge difference. So we then looked at, what is happening to the firms that are actually deploying all three of these solutions? What's going on for the firms that are using online payments, client portals, and legal CRM software? Well, surprise, surprise, they're doing pretty good. So they ended up in August of 2020. So that's a very recent data point, obviously. They ended up collecting 40% more revenue per lawyer than their peers. So in the past, our studies of technology and our conversations around evolution in these moments really assumed an academic, kind of aspirational lens, as opposed to a tangible lens. So I'd like to take a moment to kind of get you all to think about and kind of ask you, what would you be doing with 40% more revenue in this specific moment each month? And I'm sure that the answers will vary. And I wish we were all in the same room together, because I'd love to get you all to, to answer this question for me. But again, we'll just have to kind of make do. So naturally, the answers might vary, but 40% more revenue per lawyer difference. I mean, whether you are a solo attorney, whether you have members of your bars who are solos or working in small boutique practices, I mean, that's a game-changing amount. This is a game-changing difference. And even more so in a time like the present, right? I mean, every little extra bit counts. So you can really see how making little changes and making small adoptions of things really helps to make a huge impact. And we'll talk a bit more about this in the second part of this presentation and how we can really kind of make that actionable. So again, to put a number to that, and we're talking about that 40% revenue, and to make it a bit more tangible, firms that are using these three legal solutions reported $20,000 per lawyer more collected in 2019 and are projected to almost double that and to collect just shy of $40,000 in 2020. So that's about $37,600. So that's a huge chunk of change, and it's a major difference compared to firms that just aren't using these three legal solutions. And again, just to model that, out across these three use cases, and we can see the stacked one down at the end, labeled multiple solutions. And we can see that firms using electronic payments are projected to collect more. Firms using client portals are making an even bigger difference. And firms that are using CRM making an even bigger difference for them. But ultimately, firms that are using all three of these client-facing technologies are significantly outperforming their peers. They were already doing that in 2019, and that difference is simply accelerated in 2020. So that's a lot of information, but I've got even more for you. So, and not to worry, we have resources available for you so you can go back and review all this information, but we'll just keep moving forward. So this also brings us to the third section of our analysis, and which really tells us a lot about what is going on for these firms that are kind of embracing these different client-facing technologies. So to recap what we've learned so far, we saw that the economic impacts of the pandemic were and are profound and significant and have been felt across the board. Now, although more steeply in some areas than others, but they have been felt. Now, we also saw that these three technologies deployed in law firms seem to really begin to outperform their peers. So while some firms are experiencing the biggest blows, others were actually bouncing back more quickly and collecting more revenue. Now, this third section of analysis brought us to really unpacking what is going on under there in a bit more detail. So, like why and, how and why are we seeing some of this difference? And the point being that technology in and of itself, it's not a solution. It's really just a means to an end. So something else has to be going on in addition to using these technologies. And we really dug in further and tried to understand what that was. So just to round out, our third section with another anecdote, if you ever think that you're not living in an alternate timeline in 2020, just reread this quote. Matthew, a practicing lawyer says that, you'd be surprised how many people are really getting it. I had a 90-year-old sign an engagement agreement on an iPad the other day. And I read this and I think to myself, if I had pitched, the idea of using an iPad and getting your 90-year-old clients to sign your engagement agreements, a lot of lawyers probably would have been like, yeah, that's never going to happen. If we're talking a couple years ago, if I had suggested this, be like, yeah, that's not going to happen. But now we are kind of living in this incredible moment of evolution and change. And it's really driving the necessity of invention. So we're seeing people do things that we never thought that they would do before. And that's really, really exciting and kind of an idea that I want you to just keep in the back of your mind as we move through this next section. So to expand on that a little bit more, let's dig into what really drives success in this particular volatile environment that we've studied. This analysis that we did asks lawyers in terms of, dog sleeping at my feet, don't want to step on her. This analysis that we did, so we asked lawyers, in terms of success factors, and we asked clients in terms of what they consider to be the most important factors in hireability of law firms. We asked them effectively the same questions, and we stack ranked what the most important things and the least important things for the respondents are, and came up with some really interesting observations. So we see that getting client referrals and reviews was by far the top success factor for lawyers, but also the top factor in terms of determining hireability from the client perspective. And similarly, using software to organize firm operations came in at a very high second and was a clear number 2 choice. And additionally, serving the community came in at number 3. Now, it's really interesting also to see which one came in dead last, which was, surprise, surprise, having commercial office space. So, all of those years spent picking out artwork and putting it up, on your marble encrusted lobbies probably feels a bit painful and kind of a bit like, oh my gosh, did we do that before? But what we're seeing is that this factor in the face of COVID and in the face of these new changes we've had to make really is just dropped to the bottom of the list. And others are taking its place as the most important things that are driving success and hireability. And underscoring these more broadly is our notion that technology is more important to clients than ever before. And to illustrate that with a few data points, we found that 50% of consumers said that technology was more important to them now than before the pandemic. And 56% reported that they believe they should be able to deal with most legal matters remotely versus meeting in person. And that would have looked very different pre-pandemic. And similarly, another 56% of consumers said they preferred video conferencing instead of a phone call, and not out of necessity, but they just preferred it in general. Now, getting deeper into this, 69% of consumers said they prefer lawyers who can share documents through a web sharing portal or app or some kind of online interface. And 52% said they use more types of technology than they did before the pandemic. An obvious example being things like Zoom and other remote collaboration platforms. But what about Canada? How are people in Canada doing with technology? Well, this trend definitely carries over to Canadians. So a survey of 2,000 Canadians aged 65 and older, conducted by Environomics Research in July, found that 23% of Canadians over the age of 65 use video calling on their smartphone. And that number has doubled since 2019. So this is twice as many as we're doing it this time of year 2019. In addition, 6 out of every 10 people surveyed said that their use of technology has actually increased due to COVID, with many of them crediting technology as helping them keep connected with the outside world. So Canadians are also kind of feeling this push to really embrace technology in order to navigate this kind of volatile environment that we're in. And even our court systems are starting to experiment with technology. Kind of in a groundbreaking moment in June of 2020, the Ontario Superior Court actually conducted its first trial via Zoom. That's such a huge deal and really presents an incredible opportunity going forward to see if we can do things a little bit differently. But there's part of this where things start to get, I think, really interesting, kind of particularly from having a background myself with working with legal professionals in the legal industry. Our usual story is that clients are over here and lawyers are over here in terms of, their expectations. And you've heard me speak on this before, this kind of giant gap in expectations between these two groups. And what we've actually discovered this year is that for one of the first time, definitely the first time ever, we're observing that lawyer preferences and clients' preferences are starting to converge. We're all getting on the same page, and it's really exciting. And I can't tell you that that's been the case every time we've looked at this information. It's actually kind of the first time that we've seen this happen. So what's going on the lawyer side is that 85% of legal professionals say they rely on digital solutions to manage their practices. And 79% of legal professionals, and an overwhelming majority again, say they rely on the cloud to store their firm data. Now, 83% are meeting with clients virtually. 76% believe that the majority of their services can actually be streamlined when conducted virtually. And that's really important and interesting as well, because this isn't just about improving experiences on the client side, it's also about streamlining things and making them better for legal practitioners as well. And 66% of legal professionals feel that firm operations will be impacted beyond the pandemic. So again, that's a really telling insight that we're not going back to the way things were. We're starting to feel like this is going to be a part of a better normal and, not exactly as things were before. And it really leads us to kind of to the second part of this really interesting insight, which is this kind of convergence in terms of our insights and preferences. But we don't really realize the full extent of it yet. So we have lawyers reporting in overwhelming numbers that they're meeting with clients virtually, storing their data in the cloud, using electronic signatures, using software, etc. But we have, interesting enough, clients not perceiving that their law firms are using technology and not really having that expectation. So they don't really realize that law firms are going through this incredible change right now. And it's really interesting because that kind of presents this really incredible opportunity for law firms to just kind of meet client expectations that clients didn't even know they have, right? It's this great opportunity to say, hey, yeah, we can actually make this really easy for you. Like, isn't that a nice surprise? And we'll talk more about that in a minute too. And, a great example of this is kind of that under economic pressure, we saw that clients are reporting more than ever before that they're looking for alternative billing and payment models in general, kind of in their broader life, but also from legal service providers. And I'll remind us of this kind of 2018 study from the Federal Reserve on economic well-being in the US, which reported that 39% of Americans don't have the funds available to pay for a $400 emergency expense, which is about an hour and a half worth of billable time for a lawyer. And similarly, in Canada, in 2019, the Canada Affordability Index found that 54% of Canadians were living paycheck to paycheck, and 1 in 4 report that their debt load is overwhelming. And furthermore, 27% don't even have enough to meet their daily needs. So you can really imagine the strain that an unexpected legal issue would cause for most Canadians, which really, I think, really like what drives home the importance of offering flexibility when we're thinking about how clients can pay us and work with us. Now, deepening that a bit further, 78% of consumers say that lawyers should adopt pricing or payment models that make legal services affordable, right? That makes a lot of sense. And we'll talk a bit about that in a minute too. And just remember that 61% of them are thinking that in this moment, they wouldn't be able to afford legal advice, even if they realize they have a legal problem. So there's a huge opportunity to meet that demand and to kind of fill that, access to justice gap that exists there. So, okay, I see that I'm like getting tight on time. So I'm going to kind of wrap up section 1. And so I just want you to keep in mind a couple things as we move into part 2. And that is, that cloud-driven marginal gains add up, right? So deploying little changes one at a time, those things add up to and translate into huge returns for your law firm and for your members and their law firms. And again, those combined gains, they add up to huge revenue gains. So 40% improvement in revenue collected per lawyer. And that's even in times of, difficulty and like times that we're living in now. And that's a huge, huge win. And the second key takeaway I want you to keep in mind is that success really centers on the client, and perhaps more so than ever before. And it's the job of these technologies to really accomplish this and to help you and your members accomplish this for your law firms. And it's these technologies that'll help you kind of focus on your client and drive really good experiences for them. And, again, we're talking about satisfaction is a top priority for clients. Recommendations and reviews are a top priority. And flexible payment structures, again, so important. So that was a lot of information, but now we're going to move forward and talk about how we can take some of those insights and make them actionable. So let's get practical, everybody. We'll kind of shift this over to a little bit of, a tangible analysis of what we're going to talk about. So for the second part of this, we're going to talk about number 1, designing client experiences. And 2, we're going to talk about crafting your legal products to deliver on your clients' expectations and to deliver on positive client experiences. And lastly, we'll talk about leaning into change and build a little bit of a better normal. So let's begin to deep dive into step 1, which is designing client experiences. Now, again, to start, we observed that over the course of 2020 and the COVID pandemic, its economic impacts really were quite significant. And we saw that on a per lawyer basis in terms of dollars, January and February were very similar to the 2019 levels. But as the pandemic kind of started to have more of an impact, we saw a steep decline and a little bit of a bounce back, but not where we would like to be yet. And again, we also saw that firms that use multiple solutions fared much, much better in their bounce back than firms that didn't. but it doesn't quite describe what's going on. So, or a little bit of why. So I think something we often gloss over or don't spend enough time on is the journey that firms take to using those technologies that we just talked about, those three technologies. The journey they take to using those to deliver a significantly better client experience. And the part of that journey really starts in understanding who their client is. Okay, so you can design experiences. I mean, you can't design experiences for everybody. That gets insanely complicated. But if you know who your client is, if you know who you want to impress, you can design experiences around them and around their needs. And that's a really kind of core simple place to start if you're looking to kind of improve things and help your firm be a lot more flexible and sustainable during these kind of difficult times that we're in. So thinking about who's the person I want to impress, right? Who is that ideal person? And who's the person that I want to give the best client experience to? And you'll remember again that a lot of people thought that law firms were closing, right? Even though they weren't. So sometimes thinking about your client experiences, it can be just a little change, right? Even something as simple as saying, hey, we're open for business, and just improving communication. Now, the question though is, once you've identified your ideal customer profile, so your ICP, how do you build a client experience for them? How do you build something for them that they're going to acknowledge and appreciate, and a way for them to enjoy working with you? Well, the answer is doing something that firms haven't traditionally done in the past, and that's ask for feedback. But don't just ask for feedback, ask for it in an intentional way that allows your client to tell you what they really think, because that is where you're going to find the most valuable information and the most valuable tips for creating a better client experience. Now, I think some of you will remember in 2018, we looked at how lawyers and law firms collect feedback, and we found that 30%, 37% don't really regularly collect feedback, and 42% do it casually. Now, feedback is a huge, huge asset. Don't be afraid of it. Ask people what they think and use that information to build a better client experience. Now, once you start collecting feedback, you're kind of like, well, what do I do with all of this? Well, this is where you can start to think about the processes involved in your clients' interactions and experiences with your law firm. So the first step is to kind of design something called a process map. So let's say that you ask for some feedback from a client and they say, you know what, it was really, really hard to get in touch with your law firm. So you start to think about that. Okay, so what is the process for my clients to communicate with my law firm? And with a process map, you write out all of the steps for that communication. And then you kind of start to think about it. And once you can see that visualized, the next step is to identify touch points. So throughout that process, what are all of the touch points or interactions that your client has with your law firm? So whether that's talking to staff, working with technology that you use, et cetera, identify all of those key little pieces, and then you can start to really improve upon those different areas. Not only that, but once you kind of have identified all these things and you're trying to build a better client experience, it's important to communicate and set expectations with your clients. And you can do that with a service level agreement, which basically outlines, how often they can expect to hear from you, how they can get in touch with you, what kind of technology they can expect to be working with you on, how often they'll be billed, things like that, so that they're very clear on what this process is going to look like for them. And you want to answer as many of their questions ahead of time as you possibly can. And lastly, implement cloud-based or hybrid experiences at all of these different touch points and contact points. So in an effort to simplify all of their, say, communications with you, look for tools that you can use to make that happen. And if you want, you can even ask some of your clients to test out different tools and see if they like working with them. I mean, I know it's kind of like what? Why would we ever do that? But you get the best feedback that way. And then you can really figure out whether or not, what you're creating for your clients is actually going to be a good thing to add to their client experience. Okay, so step 2, I'm going to kind of try to get through this. I might run a few minutes over. I'm sorry, everybody, but I will do my best. So step 2, we're going to talk about crafting products that deliver experiences. Now, we mentioned earlier, that 40% more revenue per lawyer in August was absorbed by firms that were really kind of pulling ahead of the pack, these firms that were using multiple technologies. And we really kind of started to dig in, and we found that what these firms are doing is they're also delivering on the 4 Ps of marketing. Now, the 4 Ps are kind of a marketing concept: product, price, place, and promotion. And so we've talked about just now, we talked about placing yourself in front of your audience, identifying who your ideal client is, and also promoting different ways that you can, work better with your ideal client. But let's talk really quickly about about the product you're offering and the price that you're selling it at. And it's really important to state that I am by no means suggesting that you undervalue your services or that your members undervalue your services. That's not at all what I'm talking about here. I want to talk about making those services more available. Now, again, I mentioned that 39% of Americans couldn't afford a $400 expense, and a lot of Canadians would find themselves in the same position. But not only that, like we talked about consumers who couldn't afford a legal problem, and how 72% said that they would like to pay their legal fees on some sort of payment plan. And a lot of consumers really would like to see more flexible payment options, not just obviously when working with attorneys, but in general. And so a significant portion of that kind of mindset has to do with how people package their products and the ways out there the ways that consumers are used to kind of consuming products. So again, it's not necessarily about the prices, right? And it's not about undervaluing your work. It's about providing flexibility and maybe even packaging your services that you offer in a way that is more familiar to consumers and in a way that makes them see that they can actually afford to hire you. Now, if you don't want to take my word for it, you can see that happening out in the world. I'll touch very quickly on this. There's a fantastic company run by Aaron Levine called Hello Divorce. And I encourage you to actually visit their pricing page because it's really interesting. It looks a lot like a pricing page that you would see for, kind of any kind of like subscription service. And it's actually called membership options. So what they do is they charge a monthly fee. And for that monthly fee, their clients get a certain package, a certain number of different things, maybe this many consultations, this much advice, this many forms, etc. But they've done this in a way that makes this so much more easy for their clients to navigate, a lot familiar for their clients to understand, and also kind of ensures that they have a consistent revenue stream coming in because their clients aren't waiting for a massive one-time bill. They're actually paying in easier to make payments. So definitely check these guys out. This is kind of similar to what David Brailsford did with so I'm trying to be conscious of time, did with the British cycling team, right? Just little changes that make it easier for your clients to work with you. And so very, very quickly, I want to go over, a couple key pieces of information when you're thinking about building a client experience and making things easier for you and for your clients. You have to really get in this mindset of experimentation. And so this example in this framework was developed by IDEO, which is kind of a world-renowned design agency. And they talk about what's called the design process. And step 1 starts with empathizing. So empathizing with your client, putting yourself in their shoes and understanding what they need and what they want. And then identifying, what is the issue here? And then coming up with ideas and then coming up with a prototype to maybe solve those pain points for them. And the big key here, though, is that once you come up with your prototype and you come up with your solution, it doesn't just stop there. You have to test it and you have to implement it, and then you have to ideate. You have to keep coming back to it and keep refining it to ensure that it is the best that it can be, because it's really unlikely that your first solution is going to be just like, boom, magic wand, problem solved. Yeah, that's not how things work, unfortunately. We all wish they did, but they don't. So it's so important just to remember that don't be afraid to experiment and to figure out and try new things with your clients and really get their feedback and see how that's working for them. Now, I have a really great kind of resource for you that's included in your resource package. And it's kind of a simple client journey experiment template that we actually at Clio created. And it's going to kind of help you work through your first experiment in improving client experience. And you really begin with something super simple. And you just talk about, what is your timeline for this? And you really just keep track of how well it worked. And once your experiment's kind of over, you can go back and look at what you've learned and what worked, what didn't work, and then try it again and again and again until it's, until you find something that really sticks. Oh, sorry, my dog is barking. And so just like kind of quickly, I just want to mention that it's really, really super important, again, to not be afraid to try something over and over again, and to not be afraid to trash an idea if it's not working. This might sound, counterintuitive, but really bear with me, right? You're not going to get it right the first time. And don't get yourself into the headspace of thinking that you have to get it right the first time. If your client comes to you and says, hey, I have a problem with X, you're like, okay, well, let's try B, but then B doesn't work. Don't get discouraged. Try C, try D, try E, try the rest of the letters in the alphabet until you find something that works and you get it right. And honestly, that's kind of part of the fun. Okay, so we're getting there. We're getting there. I'm super close. Thank you all so much for bearing with me. So kind of step 3 is leaning into change to build a better normal. All right. And this is our final step. And I really just want to emphasize that change is super hard. We all know that. We've all been there. We're all going through it right now. And change under pressure and stress is even harder. So I think we should all appreciate that none of what I'm describing here is easy, but that there's a few things that you can do to challenge yourself to do, or to use tools to get into that like VUCA prime mindset. And that's obviously also what's so useful about VUCA prime, is that you kind of do away with this idea of helplessness, and you are actually feeling like you're engaging and with the change that you're trying to make. And that's, a very key critical idea behind underlying and this kind of foundational concept to creating change. Now, again, I'm a huge fan of Peter Drucker, and this is kind of one of his quotes that I think really resonates. It's culture eats strategy for breakfast. And, I don't know. I mean, the idea here is that we talked a lot about the things that you can do, the strategy and the tactics you can use, the kind of Lego blocks and the tools that you're going to use to remodel and to build your product and your client experience. But without company culture, and without having everyone on board with that culture or that change, it's really difficult to get that to stick. So I think it would be really a miss to kind of gloss over, translating these insights into action without spending some time on this particular component. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly kind of blow through it here. But, we've seen that, again, 76% of legal professionals, really believe that they can streamline their services virtually. And 58% of consumers say that technology is more important to them than ever. And, just to kind of play back from 2018, this was not always the case, right? It was not always like this. It was a lot of the time we saw that, consumers really wanted to do things one way, but lawyers really wanted to do them another way. And so for the first time, we're seeing this kind of come together and we're all getting on the same page. Yeah. And so again, I just want to reiterate, we have a really major opportunity here to kind of embrace change and to evolve and to build some momentum and develop, kind of a better normal in this really changing market that we're in. And a quick kind of resource that I want to put out there is that, the journey to developing this kind of VUCA prime mindset is a tricky one, but the mindset that you have going into that really plays a huge part in this. And there's a book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, and it talks a lot about the psychology of success. And it's really helpful to think about the different mindsets that you need in order to succeed in a VUCA kind of environment. And it really lays out the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And I won't really go into the details right now, but the book is really incredible because it helps you to understand that you need a growth mindset to really succeed and thrive in a difficult and challenging VUCA, and really to move into VUCA Prime, you have to be flexible and you can't be afraid of failure. You also like can't think of this as, you know, a zero-sum game, right? Your success should not come at the success of another person. You know, we are kind of conditioned to think of success as this like finite pie, and there's only a little bit to go around, but that's not actually the case. I mean, something that we're really passionate here about at Clio is that, you know, there's so many people out there who have legal problems that are just, they're not receiving the advice that they need. And, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not about stealing the market from your, you know, from your competition, or, you know, it's not about that there's this finite number of clients out there. It's about tapping into this kind of massive opportunity below the waterline, you know, that all of these people that aren't getting the help they need and that nobody is servicing. And you can do that by just adjusting the way that you do things. You don't even have to change your prices, just changing the way that you offer your services can go such a long way to helping you really tap into all that opportunity that exists out there. Okay, and so this is it. This is the end, everybody. You know, with that, I would like to say again that there's this tremendous opportunity out there, and you know, hopefully, my journey to kind of provide you with this tools and mindset around VUCA Prime has been a successful one. I really hope so, and I'd like to kind of invite all of you to come together to build a better normal, because things probably won't go back to the way they are, and I think we can all do better going forward. So, thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody. That was, I know, a lot, and I really appreciate your patience.
Thanks very much, Rio. That was terrific.